Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Hello, good evening everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio on this Monday evening, another show for you. And tonight we're looking at the question of whether some schools are tougher than others, whether some schools are harder than others, whether some schools are easier to be in and teach in than others, and of course the sort of implications of that as well. I'm going to be joined by a guest, which is Phil Naylor, who I'll introduce in a moment. And of course, if you at any point during this conversation this evening have any thoughts on this or you want to contribute, as always, you can click the microphone icon in the bottom left and you can get involved in the conversation that way. You can also drop us a text in the bottom right hand side. There's a little speech bubble and you can comment there. Of course, if you're listening back to this as a podcast, welcome to you, and thanks for choosing to spend a bit of time with us on your commute or your walk or wherever it is that you're listening to this conversation. And I think it's quite an important conversation because I think that quite often teachers who are working in incredibly difficult circumstances are sometimes the least platformed and the least sort of known about. So I think it's an important conversation. It's certainly something that we at Teachers Talk Radio take very seriously. We it's one of our sort of missions is to really raise those voices of the classroom teachers in particular settings and environments that are difficult to teach in and to work in. So really looking forward to the conversation, and Phil is a great guest as well. Phil, are you there?
Evening, Tom. Yes, I'm here.
Good evening to you. Now, Phil, we're going to obviously talk about this in some depth in the next sort of hour or so, but perhaps to begin with, as you're my first guest, and as I mentioned, anybody else who wants to get involved, absolutely do it. Call in, press the button in the bottom left, get involved in the conversation at any point during this chat. But Phil, just to begin with, maybe you could introduce yourself to everybody.
Yes, by all means, Tom. Good evening, everybody. So my name is Phil Naylor. I am a senior leader, a teacher, have been for about 25 years. I used to do a podcast with a very catchy jingle,
yes,
which I know that Tom loved, which is sadly retired the podcast, but the jingle's still an earworm if anyone wants to go and check out back episodes.
Oh, you've got it.
You've got to, you do. And I've written two books. The first one was after the conversations on the podcast, which is Naylor's Natter. And the second one, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, hopefully, or the themes from that, is called Some Schools Are Harder Than Others, a Smiths-inspired Tom Bennett stolen from title, which kind of exactly what Tom just said then, platforms the voices of the people that you don't hear from very much, eulogising how important it is and how enjoyable it is to work in more challenging circumstances, and encouraging you, the listener, to do the same thing.
And that's a perfect segue because our sponsor on the show tonight is, of course, John Catt Educational, who are the publishers of Some Schools Are Harder Than Others, amongst many other books. But of course, we're going to touch on some of the themes and the content and the stuff that's built inside that book, amongst other things, this evening. But if you want to get yourself a copy of Phil's book, which is still relatively new, it was published on 6th of September. But if you want to get a copy of it, if you still haven't, then use our discount code. It gets you 20% off any book on the John Catt website, johncattbookshop.com. 20% off. Use the code JCTTR2425. That's JCTTR2425. And you can get 20% off any number of books by using that coupon code on the website, including Phil's book. Phil, I just want to kick off the conversation here by asking you, I guess it relates to the title of this show, but also the title of your book. What factors do you think generally make a school considered to be tougher or easier to teach in?
Brilliant start, and that's how I started the book, Tom. So just to signpost people to another book, which I kind of took some inspiration from in the title, in the preface for this book, is a book called Rethinking School Inspection, which is a Tracy O'Brien 2023 book. And she draws from an Education Policy Institute report talking about why some schools are potentially more challenging than others. So the things that we looked at and she looked at in categorising those schools as harder were schools with more disadvantaged pupils are less likely to be judged good or outstanding, while schools with low disadvantage and higher prior attainment are much more likely to be rated highly in the good or outstanding. Secondary schools with up to 5% of pupils eligible for free school meals are over 3 times more likely to be rated outstanding than schools with at least 23% free school meals. That's 48% compared to 14%. And the secondary schools with the most free school meals pupils are much more likely to be rated inadequate than those with the least free school meals pupils. Again, the figures are 15 to 1. In primary schools, for primary colleagues, primary schools with high numbers of children on free school meals are half as likely as those with low proportions of pupils on free school meals to be judged outstanding. And the last thing on this, data-driven monologue to start with, the least deprived schools are also most likely to improve their Ofsted judgment and least likely to be downgraded even after accounting for previous Ofsted judgments. So that's one factor or a set of factors in making some schools harder than others.
Interesting. And it's funny you mentioned that about the Ofsted grades and reports. I taught in a school that was, for want of a better word, categorically stuck in requires improvement, inadequate, special measures, and it was positioned in a well, I haven't got the stats in front of me, but I would imagine one of the hardest areas of the country, similar to where you've spent your career, Phil, which is Blackpool, isn't it? And I spent a bit of time in Blackpool myself and teaching there for, I think it was 4 months just before the pandemic kicked off. And there's certain places that are more difficult to teach in. It's just a fact, right? Well, is it a fact? That's what we're discussing tonight, because some people may disagree with that. There's other people who might say, you know what, teaching is just teaching. Children are just children, right? I mean, my parents have said that to me. Kids are just kids. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. And you know what? There's some truth in that. There is some truth in that, in my experience. But when it comes to the wider school picture that you've just mentioned, that's really what I want to dig into, because what's the knock-on effect of those judgments, Phil? Because you've just mentioned that. So what's the knock-on effect of that?
Right. Well, as you know, Tom, I love to talk. So it's an occupational hazard, isn't it, for a teacher? So I'll just kind of dress up this in a roundabout bigger picture. So you mentioned there that I teach in Blackpool, which I'm very proud to do and have done for a while. But in terms of even the schools that I've taught at within Blackpool, there's a very large contextual difference. So, just to give listeners a potted history of my career, I started teaching 25 years ago, which is why I only do audio on these kind of things. Nobody wants to see that face after 25 years of teaching. But I started in an outstanding single-sex all-girls school 25 years ago, where the results were 95% pass rate. I'm not saying it was easier, I'm just saying it was different. And then I worked in good schools for remaining sort of 17, 18 years until I took a leap into a school which was considered to be, one of these harder schools and much more challenging. And the leaver speech, which opens the chapter, Tom, at the beginning, was from the head teacher at the time. He introduced my leaver speech by saying, well, Phil's off to school X. He's either brave or he's stupid or both. And it was just like, that is the perception of going to work in these challenging circumstances. because so many careers have been
Mm.
laid to waste in trying to turn around and make a difference in these challenging circumstances. And I do agree with your parents there, Tom, about I love nothing more than teaching the students in the classroom, which is still what I do 90% of the time during the day. And a lot of that isn't too different between the schools, but the amount of other stuff that goes with it is definitely what makes those other schools much, much harder. And I think that anyone who hasn't worked in them, I encourage them to do so, but it certainly is much more challenging in my view.
Well, I wanted to dig into that. Do you believe, I mean, you've answered this question, but I want you to dig into the why in much more detail in this conversation. I mean, do you believe there is a significant difference between teaching in different schools, or is that just a perception from the outside of what it's like to teach in those schools? And me and you have, or you and I, sorry, have, see, that was my mum correcting my grammar coming into my head. You and I have both taught in different schools, and certainly we've both taught in the category of school that I guess we're talking about here. Do you think there's a significant difference between the two, or is that based largely on perception?
No, I think there is, and I think that the school's environment is shaped by lots of different, socioeconomic demographics, potentially behaviour, although not exclusively behaviour being particularly different in both those things, but also access to resources as well. So, in terms of these tough schools are serving communities with high levels of, socioeconomic deprivation. If you think about the impact even of the pandemic, which is the recent history, a head teacher I used to work with in Blackpool talked about, we've all been navigating navigating a big storm in the last 3 or 4 years, but some of us have been in different boats. Was the conversation around that? So these kind of socioeconomic factors can affect things like low attendance rates. It can also affect behaviour difficulties. There's lots of different factors to consider alongside the classroom teaching that we need to do as well. And that's part of what I'm encouraging people to do. That's part of what people who choose to work in these schools want to do and want to help and want to make a difference. But at the same time, while you're doing that, you are judged according to the same criteria that schools without some of those challenges are judged. And it's very, very difficult to do that and be rewarded for that in terms of, Ofsted badges, exam results, career progression. All of those different things are much, much more challenging in those schools, in my view.
I just want to give a shout out to listeners. Jane's here, Rebecca's here, Nathan's here, Scientific's here. I can't remember his first name, but he's a regular listener, and thank you. Matt Webb, Peter, JBL, Andrew, John, and lots of others are here as well. So thanks for spending a bit of time with us. I wanted to delve into what you've just said, though, because how do teachers' personal experiences shape their perception of a school as challenging or easier? Example, I, in some ways, not in an overall picture, but in certain ways, I find it easier to teach in a more challenging school. Because I'll give you my one specific reason why. Because I find that the kids generally can be more straight with you, right? That's what my experience has been. I found them to be, and of course I'm secondary, not primary. So, we're talking maybe, different types of challenges maybe from primary and secondary. But I found within the secondary context that the children in the more challenging schools that I've worked in have been more direct. There haven't been as many sides, and it's been, yes, perhaps there's been more chance of there being some sort of confrontation or some sort of challenging situation or whatever. But in terms of being able to read situations and to feel comfortable in what that is. Now, I don't know whether that's because I was born in Birkenhead. I don't know if that's what that is, but there's something about that has definitely rung true through my experiences over time. However, the flip side of that for me has been that the actual challenges are more regular and more intense, and perhaps the broadness of the challenge has in those more challenging schools has been bigger, in the sense that you could probably go through a week or two in perhaps one of the in inverted commas less challenging schools I've taught in, where you aren't being put in those incredibly high stress situations, perhaps as often or at all, perhaps, than you would be elsewhere. What do you think, Phil?
Right, before I answer that, Tom, can I say a couple of hellos? Am I allowed to do that? Because there's two people on the call who I can't believe that they spend their evening listening to me when they've both worked with me and surely have had enough of listening to me. So to Beth and to Bernie, who appear to be in the chat there, hello to both of you. Surely you've got something better to do listen to me on a Monday night, but clearly not. Clearly not. But there we go. So they both would be good contributors as we move through, Tom, because they've both worked in those kind of contexts and will be able to talk with a lot of authority about the challenges that they faced and the benefits of doing that as well. So hello to both of those. Right, in terms of what you said there, I agree with a lot of what you said. This is the thing. When I was told I'm brave or stupid to go and work in a school that's, had challenges over time, what did I find when I walked through the door? And I wrote about it in the book. I found, brilliant students who I recognised, and a lot of I recognise in terms of, I'd been like them. I'd been to a school very similar as well. And I think this is a motivational factor in a lot of people who contributed to the book, Tom. A lot of people who are leading these schools and have done some chapters for me actually, grew up in, these particular areas, went to these harder schools and benefited, hugely from that. Hence the reason that they are where they are now. A lot of them head teachers in the school. So, shout out to Mark Allen, who's head teacher of a school. He's very proud to have come from that community, worked in that community, and now leading a school in that community. Aziza the same, because she talks in her chapter about, how education provided for her and what she has provided back for the students in her school. And the same with Liv, who's just starting her journey in terms of, her journey into being a teacher. So, there's a lot of people who identify with the students in those schools because they were students in those kind of schools themselves. But what did I find, in terms of what makes you want to work there? Massively committed pastoral teams, Tom. You'll have worked with, teams like that. You just get the most dedicated, hard-working pastoral teams working in schools like this who enjoy the work and the benefits that they provide. You also find really hard-working parents who are doing 2 and 3 jobs, just trying to make sure that they can provide the best for their kids. And I tell you what you also find, and this is the point of the topic altogether, you've got to find some of the most knowledgeable and the hardest working teachers, because like you said, Tom, you've got to have a relationship to open the door to any kind of teaching to start with. You've got to be skilled and knowledgeable to plug all the gaps that potentially these students have got. You've got to be resilient for when those challenges do happen, and they do happen, to bounce back day after day after day, like you've done, Tom. I've seen you do that in Blackpool. Day after day, coming back. No, but you did, and for listeners' benefit, I'm sure that a lot of you have conversations with Tom. I've actually met him as well. He's a lovely guy, top man. I've met him in actual real life as well, so I know that he has done this. So that's definitely the case. So I don't know what the question was, but there we go. I went on all about the finding schools.
But I wanted to ask Phil in terms of But I'll try and give you a better example of my question. I would find teaching primary a huge challenge. Okay, right? So in the same way that you might look at someone and say, well, they're a good teacher, but they'd find that particular context impossible or just such a big challenge for various reasons. Would the same apply to someone who just feels natural in a more challenging environment? So they then say, well, this is easier. Or vice versa. Is it actually just to do with perception of the challenge rather than the challenge itself?
I think perception's definitely got something to do with it. And like I said at the beginning, if you're going to get a leaver speech, and I'm sorry to dig Simon out twice in the same conversation about saying to me, but he knows I've given him a signed copy of the book, Tom, and I've said, and he's very happy to admit that he did say that. So he's absolutely happy with that.
Well, but, I think it was a joke. I think it, in fairness, okay, it's light-hearted, but it's sort of true within the context of the profession we're working in. Remind people who've just joined what he said, because they may have missed the beginning.
He said, so like I said, the setup for this is 20. I was 20 years into teaching at that time, worked in pretty much exclusively good and outstanding schools, not always in the most affluent areas, but certainly, you know, schools with the coveted badges of good and outstanding. I had never worked in a school that had requires improvement or inadequate or anything like that. But when I decided that I would go and work in the school that I did work in when I was writing this book, he said, you know, to go and take that particular job, not necessarily that school, but that particular job, you're either brave or stupid or both. And you know, that was a leaver speech in front of all the staff. That wasn't a throwaway comment in the you know, in the canteen or on the way out. So that's something that people, to answer your question, that's something about perception that people will struggle with. If you see a job that is up at a school that is wearing that particular badge and think, right, is that going to be the job for me? The perception is, right, that is going to be extremely challenging. If I succeed, you know, it'll be really rewarding. I'll get to work with some fantastic people and some great students. But what impact will that have on my career? Because while I'm on a roll, Tom, am I all right to talk about the people that come in and advise in these schools? Because these are the kind of things that might put you off as well.
Go on.
Well, the perception, because this is why I'm picking up on this angle, is that when you're working in one of these schools, this is what a lot of the contributors said, is you get a lot of external support. And a lot of it is well-meaning and well-intentioned, coming from people who work in those cherished, good and outstanding schools. And they often come into these schools and requires improvement or inadequate and advise and tell them, well, this is what we do in our school in, and I'm sorry, listener, you know, stereotypical leafy suburb. And they had things like, and I won't name the name of the person who told me this story, but they said they were, you know, chasing a good set of results for year 11 in order to get, you know, Ofsted or make Ofsted a little bit happier. And one of the advisors that they brought in, who'd worked for 25 years, seems to be a theme, doesn't it? 25 years. 25 years in a leafy suburb school, said to the deputy head of this school, have you thought about doing revision lessons? And he just like, well, do you know what? Funnily enough, yes, we have done things like that. And it's just the way that the perception from people outside is that everybody who works in a requires improvement or inadequate schools, typically one of these harder schools in these more challenging areas, are inadequate themselves. And they talk to them in those terms. You know, I work in a good school, therefore I am good and outstanding. You work in an inadequate school, therefore you need lots and lots of help. And I'm going to tell you something quite obvious that you probably are already doing, but I don't think you are because you're not good or outstanding. And that's a perception around what these schools are like. Because quite often these schools have to have the best leaders, the strongest teachers, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to be as, you know, as functioning as they are currently, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, I was thinking about this, funnily enough, this morning, and I tweeted something on my personal account about it because I keep hearing people say, in inverted commas, I've worked in 2 outstanding schools. I currently work in an outstanding school, as if not saying it on a factual level, saying it as a sort of a brag, like sort of like this reflects on me as a teacher, as a practitioner. And I guess, as you've just said, the question would be, how is that relevant to you as a practitioner? And I guess my sort of thinking was around how, you know, how hard it is to work in these schools that you're talking about. It's not easy to be a teacher in a school where not only are you managing what happens on the day-to-day, but also you're managing what others perceive that you are as a professional, and that the school is as a professional body, and the staff is as a professional staff body. And, you know, and as I said, now I've worked in a few along those lines, and it's tough. It's tough because the staff do feel it. Do you agree with that, Phil? Do you think the staff feel it? Like, be honest. The staff do feel it. I know you've said they're amazing, and a lot of them are, but there's also that element of being a bit downtrodden. I personally, that's my personal. It's very tough to, you know. There was one particular school I worked in. It was people were down, right? They were doing an amazing job. They were so resilient as a group of people, and I was there for about 18 months. But they were so resilient as a group of people. But but they were a bit downtrodden, you know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that is definitely a factor. But in terms of the book, this is how I started the book, Tom. So I started the book by, having spoken to a lot of people, having been in that circumstance, having seen schools go into those categories and being a little bit like, well, some of these Ofsted categories are really unfair. And what they end up doing, Tom, when you go into those categories, and this is what happens, is lots of people end up leaving. So if those teachers in those inadequate and requires improvement schools are inadequate or requires improvement themselves, then how come immediately following any Ofsted inspection, they all get promoted posts and move elsewhere? That's a kind of a strange unintended consequence of the thinking they don't want to go through that scrutiny. So I maybe wouldn't go as far as you did there in terms of feeling downtrodden, but they certainly feel up against it and they certainly feel under pressure because
That's what I mean.
Yeah,
That's
I know you do. I know you do.
It's
Yeah.
backs to the wall, like they're up against it every day. It's not like, it's not happy-go-lucky, is what I'm saying.
It's certainly challenging, but not because of the students or the context
No.
or the environment, but because of everything that goes with that accountability.
Correct.
And
the pressure.
And when you're in those circumstances and those things happen to you, it's extremely difficult to move on from that because, as you said before, the perception is, well, you work at school X and school X has category Y, so therefore you must be that. It's very difficult to move on from that. But that's how the book started, Tom, because I thought, right, and as Bernie and Beth will be in there going, oh, God, Naylor's moaning again. We don't want to listen to that. So I thought, right, well, let's do something positive with this because lots and lots of people are succeeding in those challenging circumstances. Lots of people are providing real optimism for teachers that are working in these environments and want to encourage more people to do the same. That's how this whole thing started. So if I can just go on again, Tom, if that's all right, and just say,
go on.
Right, so this is how I went about the book. So, that's the circumstance we start in. You're brave or you're stupid. You've gone to a particular context. It hasn't necessarily, in terms of Ofsted badge, changed much at this moment in time. So how can we make things move a little bit further? Right, let's have a look at the top 10 schools in the country for, accounting for free school meals, pupil premium, and say, what are they doing in terms of results and how are they getting on? I wasn't bothered about Ofsted categories necessarily. I was looking at how are they getting results for their students. And then it was literally a case of getting a results table and going, right, here's a school, in Portsmouth, for example, because that was one of them, and saying, let's go and find somebody who works in that school, who wants to speak to me, who can tell me why it's brilliant to work in these harder schools and what other people can learn from that. So we did a lot of...
but how did you know they were harder schools?
Because of the context. So I sorted for any schools above 35% on free school meals, pupil premium, all those metrics against the A to C. God, tell them how old I am, can I? Against the the scores that they got in terms of their kind of progress 8 scores, whatever it might be. And I had a table for this and said, right, how are these doing well? And then it was a lot of emails to admin at school X. Would anybody from this school be interested to talk to me about why it's really a difficult context to work in, one, but two, why you are succeeding or doing really well in that context.
But did you also check the sort of, because also you can look at different bits of data that would say that the sort of, in inverted commas, the white working class boys are the worst performers when it comes to exam results, and then you've got some ethnic minority groups who are also perhaps on pupil premium, but their results are incredibly high.
I feel like you could do a follow-up book, Tom, because you've
no. But I'm saying,
you've thought about this. You've gone into. No, you're right.
That definition of a harder school is an interesting one because a school might appear on the metric you've just said to be, say, more difficult than the school, 2 miles down the road, without exploring other demographics and other factors and other sort of interesting elements there. Yeah. That was all I was throwing in.
No. And again, like I said, I mean, John Catt are obviously keen to get new books pitched, Tom. So that could be, you could go for some schools. Some schools are even harder than others. Perhaps that could be the follow-up. But I wasn't that forensic in the detail, and perhaps I should have been.
No, but I take your point. You were going on that sort of face value. I get it.
Yeah, and also I thought it was time to hear from, as you said, and this is what Teachers Talk Radio is really good at doing, is platforming people who don't necessarily get that platform because they're not edu superstars or anything like that. So I didn't want a book now. I'd done obviously the first book, which had lots of people who I'd interviewed who were really good, dead generous with their time. And I'm not denigrating anybody who's, quite big in terms of the education circuit, that sort of thing. That's absolutely fine. But this book wasn't about that. It was about, right, who is working in one of these schools, who can talk to people about why they want to work in that school and what kind of difference it makes. So people in the book, aren't necessarily education or edu Twitter or whatever we call it these days. They're not big hitters from there. They're just people that work in these schools that would give me time in their summer holidays to talk about, right, what are the challenges? One, and everybody's talked about the different challenges that they've got in their schools. Why did they want to work there? And what tips and advice could they give for other people who want to work there? Because that was point of the book as well. We want to make sure that any jobs that are advertised in these schools are absolutely jam-packed with applicants who are saying, right, I want to go and make a difference. Because all teachers do that anyway, but I want to go and make a difference in these communities, for these students, for these communities, to try and, share that experience and do something with that. And that's what everybody in the book did.
I've got a few comments here that I want to read out that people have made. So I'll read out a few of them. I got one text in from Anonymous who said, 100%, I was parachuted as a deputy into an inverted commas failing school. And people went from treating me like an outstanding leader to being a failing leader at county events and such like. So that was one comment we had. I'll read out a few more and then we can circle back. Jane said, there's a difference, I think, between tough schools and schools in a category. Tough schools are great to work in. Mine has 62% pupil premium. I would only work in deprived schools, to be honest. I've also worked in categories, and those are harder because there's outside pressure. So that was that. We've also had Miss Dundas, who has said, I work in AP with high levels of PP and SEND, which are challenging at times, but I would not change it for the world. For me to have an outstanding leadership team who support you makes a massive difference, but I honestly would not go back into mainstream quickly. Now, you know what I find interesting here, and this is a question I wanted to ask you, Phil. And you know what? I've worked in all these different types. I've worked in a special school. I've worked in an AP. I've worked in a mainstream school. I've worked in a private independent mainstream school. I've also worked in schools in inverted commas, deprived areas, difficult places, tough schools, right? I've worked in all four of them. Which would you say, what is the harder school out of those? Is there a harder one?
Well, like I said, I mean, the categories that I gave you at the beginning are what would be considered to be harder in this context for this book. I mean, I think the rest of that's down to personal perception, isn't it? Because, there's no right or wrong answer to that, is there? But the schools that I was
No, there isn't. That's what I'm saying. There isn't, because people might look at that and go, well, obviously working in an AP is harder on certain levels. But I didn't find that myself. I personally didn't find that.
So to get my podcaster's hat back on then, Tom, so go on.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at BetUK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at BetUK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
What made a harder school for you, and which one did you, in your words, prefer working in, and why?
Well, for me, the difficulty was with the volume of teaching I did in certain schools and the whole class dynamic when you've got 30 plus students. So the class size was a factor, the volume of lessons that you needed to teach. When I was teaching in an AP, and also when I taught in a special school, but completely different, but similar in terms of class size and volume of teaching, it's just a very different setting. It was more like tutoring in a way. I'm not saying it was completely like tutoring, it wasn't, obviously in the AP you had, I mean, I think I've told this story before, but I ended up like following this student around Skelmersdale, because the head of the AP told me to do it. He said, you're going to have to walk around with him. So I walked around with this. I basically was like walking around Skelmersdale with this lad, like in the afternoon, because he just decided to walk out of the centre. Now, obviously the level of challenge from some of those students was quite high, but the context of teaching was something I just found it a bit easier than having 30 students and doing 4 or 5 lessons a day in that environment, when it's that mainstream environment of having 30 in, where, especially in those more challenging areas where maybe you do have not more of those. Yeah, you do probably have more behaviour issues. So that's my answer to that question. What I'm saying is, like, there's that perception, isn't there, of it's an AP, it's this environment, so therefore it's harder. And I'm just saying that its context is really important.
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, in terms of the harder schools that I've worked in, I've absolutely loved every minute of it. And, again, to mention for the third time, the speech that Simon gave, I've never regretted any of those decisions for a moment, because what kind of experiences and people that I've worked with and the difference that I feel that we have made in terms of the things that we've done, I wouldn't change that for the world. What I would change, and I loved the person who sent that in, it sounded just like me, going along to a county event. I can well imagine, said, oh, you work in that school, do you? Oh, well, and this perception that you mustn't be as good as other people. Whereas actually what I found is, some of the greatest teachers that I work with have worked in those. While we're on that theme, Tom, can we put somebody on the spot? Are we allowed to request people to speak? Because Bernie Kay, unmute your microphone, because I'm sure that Teachers Talk Radio want to hear from you.
Well, where is he? How do we request
Bernie, she is Uber geek. Bernie's hiding behind there. Come on, Bernie. Unmute yourself.
Does he want to come on?
She will want to come on. I'm sure she will.
Sorry, we'll invite Uber Geek and see if she wants to come on.
Yes, okay. Invite her on.
But while we're waiting for Uber Geek, I wanted to ask you, in what role do you think the community surrounding a school plays in A, the school's culture, and B, the perceived difficulty of the school?
Right. So in terms of that community, like I said, you find the most hardworking, dedicated parents who, probably themselves have been to that school, are vested in that school because they've experienced the community there. The students, these kind of schools, generally speaking, do not have buses coming in because they live in the area. They're very much community schools. And Mark Allen, in his chapter, talks about that really, really well, about how proud his students are to go to that school. And he talks really about raising aspirations and how we can make sure that everything that they're doing in that school can help raise aspirations for students, for disadvantaged students, but also for the community as well. And their staff go over and above, I know it's a cliche, to try and make sure that they are positive with those high expectations of what students in those schools can do. And he's the living, breathing example of that. So he talks about that. He says, but the key point here is, no matter how good your pastoral care is, I think it's the quality of teaching and learning and the strength of the curriculum that creates that culture of high expectations and makes a difference for those students in those schools.
Oof. Uber Geek has joined us. And Uber Geek, you've made some interesting comments. You've said a harder school is a badly run school.
Yeah, so my experience is I've always worked in schools in categories, and that was deliberately so. And I think that has a shelf life, if I'm being completely honest. I think you've only got so much in your battery, and a couple of years ago I decided I needed to possibly see if there was anything else out there, because you tire to it, and I think that's only natural. And I think that situation is made even more tiresome in schools that don't have that really strong leadership, and everybody's kind of reinventing the pathway and not working strategically. So yes, certainly tough schools are hard to work in, but they can be made easier with strong leadership.
Yeah, no, I mean, Phil, any thoughts on that, on what Uber Geek? Sorry, I keep forgetting your name, Uber Geek.
Yeah, it's Bernie.
Bethany. Bernie, sorry. Phil, go on. Any thoughts on that?
I can't hear Bernie. I can't believe that. I don't know if everybody else can. I can't hear her, but maybe
it sometimes does that. I mean, I heard everything that she said. Bernie, just to come back, you feel you're just going to have to wait in the wings. Bernie, what I was going to ask in follow up to that was, are you saying that if a in inverted commas easier school has a poor leader, perceived to be poor leader, that school would be harder to teach in than a tougher school that had a good leader?
Yeah, absolutely that. I think, well, number one, I don't think a leader is singular, and I think leadership teams are multifaceted.
Leadership,
So I think I've worked in incredibly tough schools which have been really positive places to work and actually quite easy places to get up in the morning and go to, because they've had really strong dynamic leadership and, you know, a strong vision and a collective kind of mission. But I've also worked in schools that have been really badly led, and it's kind of like the blind leading the blind, and it's just really soul destroying.
Yeah. Phil, you won't have heard that, but don't worry. I think it's a good time for me to pivot to you next and ask you about it. In what ways we've sort of touched on this already, but in what ways do you think socioeconomic factors influence teaching environments? I'm interested in this one because we sort of touched on it. You've sort of, if you like, measured your sort of, in inverted commas, harder schools based on the numbers. Well, one factor was the number of people, premium students in the school. So what ways do socioeconomic factors, do you think, influence the teaching environment in the classroom?
Right. Hopefully you can hear me, Tom.
Yeah, I can.
You can. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it can have a profound effect, can't it, on the culture? So, you know, there's these schools where students and families are struggling with, you know, lots and lots of issues around making ends meet, that kind of thing. I know some of this is, you know, stereotypical. I'm not trying to be, you know, bracketing every single school the same, but you asked me about what those factors would be. So, you know, they can have issues with things like truancy, things like disengagement, things like absence, not because of, you know, the fact that students don't necessarily want to come to school, but they're navigating lots of complex factors, you know, looking after relatives, whatever it might be. There's lots of complicated things in there. So socioeconomic factors can affect everything from, you know, funding for the school, student well-being as well. Obviously, you know, some of these students can be dealing with more complex home lives. Those more complex home lives might show themselves impacting on behaviour and engagement as well. So the students that are living in poverty means that the challenges potentially stemming from that poverty, you know, are present in many schools and will present themselves with, you know, what might look like a routine lack of engagement and students not involved in the lesson. Maybe that they have been literally up all night and doing lots of different things, you know, even looking after siblings while parents are working, like I said, 2 or 3 jobs, those kind of things. So they do have impacts in the classroom. And I think these are often not understood by people who haven't worked in these circumstances, and they just put that all down to lack of engagement, poor behaviour, truancy, you know, the fact that students aren't attending school. You know, I mean, I'm sure that you read with interest as well around this idea that potentially that these schools who are already potentially struggling on the current framework are now going to be judged on absence rates as well. Because if you look at some of the figures around that, it's disproportionately schools in challenging circumstances that have most of the issues with truancy. And it's just another factor to consider when you're thinking of, one, working in those schools, or two, leading them.
Listen, amazing conversation so far, and thanks everyone who's been listening along. If you're interested in what we're talking about, or anything else for that matter, I do need to thank our sponsor site, which is John Catt Educational, which are a leading publisher of books and resources for teachers in the UK and beyond. If you want to check them out, they're at johncattbookshop.com, and you can use our code JCTTR2425 to get Phil's book or any other book on the John Catt website with 20% off. So definitely check that out. Phil, I wanted to ask you about the sort of student population next. And Bernie, you can feel free to jump in as well. Obviously, Phil might not be able to hear you, but I can hear both of you. How do you think student needs vary between schools? And does that affect how tough a school feels to work in? I mean, we've sort of just covered that, I guess, but When we say needs, it can be anything. Anyone want to jump in? Phil? Bernie?
Yeah, so
Flo?
it's a really interesting question. Took me a while to think about that, and I think student need is completely contextual in some respects. You know, I've worked in schools with significant levels of attachment where the minute you walk in the building in the morning, you've got somebody kind of glued to you as a school leader. And I've worked in communities where you don't feel as needed as a school leader, and you're quite a remote figure, where you know you're very much having a strategic role, and you're not really necessarily part of the immediate community in the school, if that makes sense. You're not as I felt needed, and I felt not so needed from that respect.
Yeah, got you. Phil, I don't know if you've got anything to add on there.
I'm not sure what she said, Tom. So I'm sure that whatever she said, having worked.
But did you hear my question though? About
I did hear your question, but just remind me.
So it was, how does working with high need or at risk? Sorry, the previous question. How do students' needs vary between schools, and does that affect how tough a school feels to work in?
Well, I don't know what Bernie said. Like I said, so in terms of my experience of that, or other people's, you know, I would potentially or personally want to work in these more challenging contexts. Like I said, you know, I mean, my results, Tom, in the first 2 years of teaching, when I was just fresh out of being a football coach into a classroom, I thought I must be the greatest science teacher in the world, because every single student in all of my classes passed every single exam. Now you might say, well, that's, you know, down to some unknown genius that potentially you had, but it's more likely down to the fact that these students, you know, had lots of resources, lots of support networks, were able to draw on, you know, lots of support and help outside of school as well as what they got in school. Whereas potentially, you know, when you're working in these harder schools, you are making such a massive difference to those students and to their lives, and making it, you know, a direct effect on what kind of things they achieve moving forward. So I think that's the thing that keeps people wanting to work in these circumstances. Tom, while I'm on, have we got some potential for some suggestions for people who either might want to work in these schools?
Yeah. Go.
Right, so I've got some ideas at the end of the chapter, and the listener might come back at me and say this is nonsense, and these are the kind of things that you can't do. So schools in these contexts, as Bernie will agree, you know, are difficult to recruit to, and that was why this book was really trying to be positive and say, you know, these are the best places to work. And there's lots of brilliant comments that people have put on who do work in schools like this as well. But it is difficult to recruit to those areas. So here were some ideas that I thought of that I think have been trialed before, but here's some ideas about what could make it easier for people to work in those circumstances. So the first one is schools be able to grow their own teachers. One of the most short-sighted and frankly wrong, in my view, knock-on effects of an Ofsted inadequate inspection is that you're not allowed to have ECTs. Now, that's incredibly short-sighted, because it speaks to what Bernie was talking about before. It says that you as a school are not capable of, you know, developing new teachers because the leadership of the school is not good enough, and the teachers that are in there couldn't possibly. And how would you ever get out of a situation there? So people I spoke to for the book, Tom, the knock-on effect of that is, what happens then? Right, you can't appoint ECTs who potentially could be highly qualified graduates. What you can employ is a supply teacher. And I no disrespect to supply teachers, you know, at some stage, I'm sure we'll all potentially have a go at being a supply teacher at some stage, and maybe a lot of people who are online have. But some of the supply teachers now aren't necessarily specialised or even qualified teachers in particular areas, and can't possibly give a school in this circumstance what they potentially need in terms of subject specialism. So harder schools should be retained the ability, regardless of context and Ofsted criteria, to recruit and train their own teachers. It's essential. And I think that these teachers should be paid more, Tom, as well. I think there should be a weighting, as there is equivalent in London, for schools with a certain category. And I'd have to come up with the category, because you've made me think when you talked about all those other ratios before, about what it would be. But I think that, you know, the challenge that you take, and the last thing would be that teachers that work in these harder schools need to sign up for longer contracts. And I know there'll be some legalities around this, and these are just my views and ideas, but I've never worked in a school where I haven't seen year 7 through to year 11. I think a lot of these schools sometimes can be used as stepping stones for people who are quite ambitious. Come in, do a year, get a good set of results, move on. come in, do a few months, don't like it, move on. I know that happens, but I think it happens more in these circumstances. So I think teachers in these harder schools to potentially be signed up to longer contracts so that they can have the benefit of their experience for a longer period of time to benefit those students.
And are you saying that in sort of financial compensation terms, they'd be paid more for the longer contract? Is that what you're saying?
It's an idea. Yes, I think that needs to be, because if you think about it, when we had that conversation and saying, right, well, you're either brave or stupid to go in here because of the collateral damage that might have to your career moving forward. And I'm sure that other people who've put comments on, and I'm reading a few of those, feel the same. It's very difficult if you succeed in these schools in terms of Ofsted criteria or sets of results, then you undoubtedly will fly on to any number of promoted positions. But if it's challenging, which it potentially has been for years and years and years, and the inspection system isn't really balanced in your favour or weighted in your favour, then it's very difficult to move on from that. So I think
also you could just be lucky and go into one of these schools and get one or two good sets of results, one good Ofsted inspection, and then be hailed the hero, and then move on into one of those promoted roles.
Yeah, you could, and it does happen. Like I said, one of the first things that happens following an inspection that doesn't potentially go the right way is that there is, a mass movement of teachers who think, right, do I fancy 2 or 3 years of scrutiny from HMI and Ofsted?
Yeah.
Not particularly. So I'll probably go and work somewhere a little bit further. And that's something that happens a little bit more often now, because there are lots of jobs available for talented people to want to go to. But I think if you see a year group through from 7 to 11, you're really having an impact on the culture, on the outcomes of everything else. I think that's where your legacy, particularly in leadership, but certainly in classrooms as well. So I think that, signing up for that. And also, this idea, again, just throwing these out there, we talked about community hub schools, so schools that have other services built in. So schools that have, doctors' surgeries, pharmacies, that they have dentists, opticians, all in a campus-style situation where it becomes a focal point of the community, becomes the place to be. I know a lot of schools open in the evenings for community groups and involvement and give those facilities for free. But being the real centre of the community and a hub where people can get together.
Is that the devil's advocate? I guess the sort of devil's advocate on that would be, does that put more responsibility even than there already is onto schools? Is that, some people would shout, oh, nanny state, and that sort of thing. Do you think that's a element there, or do you think that the benefits outweigh any of those sort of concerns or points?
I think I'm not suggesting that the teachers do all of those jobs, because currently, I think that the teachers who are listening in would feel as if, certainly in the last few years, pandemic onwards, that we have been expected to do lots of other roles within society because, of the fact that those aren't necessarily being done elsewhere, or not being able to be done elsewhere, I should say, because of restrictions that other people are under. So I'm not suggesting that they do that, but what I'm saying is lots of these schools are schools that parents have been to, grandparents have been to, children go to. Lots of people live in the community. They don't come in on buses or cars. They walk to this. So having facilities that are accessible around the school environment, the school back to being. If you look at where, schools are built 100 years ago, 150 years ago, they were in the centre of the community alongside the doctor, the village hall, the town hall, the local shops, and all those kind of things, building that community. And also, again, Tom, this is one of the best bits of working in these schools. I've been, I live relatively local to one of the schools that I have worked in previously. And, when you go into, as I do, Specsavers or whatever it is, and the students come up, and the students come over and speak to you and say hello to you. Again, personal reflection. I was in A&E last week. Nothing serious, listener. Don't panic. But one of the students came over and spoke and said hello, and said hello to the person that I was there with as well. And you just think these are the benefits of working in these schools. That the community feel is so strong that they see you as, one of the members of the community in the same circumstances that they are, and they're the most warm, welcoming and friendly people you could ever want to meet. And that's why I'd encourage everyone to try and work in these schools if they get an opportunity.
Although the downside of that is the first school I worked in, which was in sunny North Wales, I lived 5 minutes drive from the school. And it was a bit like The Simpsons, with ha ha Nelson. You open your front door and trip over something, and suddenly you hear like ha ha from like somewhere. I'm exaggerating, but seriously, like, you're 5 minutes from the school, you walk, like, literally, it was that community school. Everywhere you went, there was just somebody from the school. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, but that's nice though. You do feel part of it, and you do feel embedded into the community and what it's about. And I mean, I was there for 5 years, and I did that 7 to 11 of what you said with a form group. And actually, funnily enough, about 6 months ago, I was in Spain, and myself and my partner got off a plane, walked through the lounge, and lad comes over. You won't mind me calling him by his name, Regan. He came over, and he was like, "Oh, Mr. Rogers," and whatever. And he was from that school, and and he was in that form, and there's something about that just, you do develop something authentic, something real, something that's, a lot of people talk about relationships with students, and it's very easy to say, I've got relationships with students. Yeah, okay. But when, like you say, when you've done what you've done, Phil, which is 20-25 years in schools, and, you stay there for a while and you get to know the kids, there's nothing like that. There's not many things like that when it comes to that sort of bond and sort of, real, like lasting impact you can have. And
well, wait till you get to the stage, Tom, where obviously I've worked in different towns. So I worked in Burnley previously, and without going into too much personal detail, I've taught the mothers of all of my daughter's friends, which is absolutely a very strange concept. But I tell you what, it does make behaviour at birthday parties much better. When you can make sure that all the parents are also behaving as well when you've taught them all. So that's how old I am, listener.
Right, we're moving towards the final bit. So I wanted to ask you about, and you've sort of touched on this already with your list of factors, because you butted in, Phil, and asked yourself that question and answered it. But I'm sure there's more you can say. And we'll ask Bernie as well to chip in on this. What can be done to make tough schools more supportive and attractive for teachers and students alike? Bernie, I want to ask Bernie first. Bernie, can you hear me still?
I absolutely can hear you, and I'm just thinking again, and I have to say, I mean, you can say what you want about the new ECF framework, but I think what it's done is it's really invested time into mentors, and I think certainly the kind of addendums that have happened of late and the 30 hours of training for mentors, it's got to have an impact with the new folk coming into the profession and subsequently, the pupils. I think all of the work around MPQs and things like that, we are just continually trying to develop the profession, which I think is only going to make it more attractive in the long run.
Yeah.
Obviously paired with the right time, and I don't think we've got that balance yet in schools. We've invested in a lot of high quality professional development. I've never seen better professional development, in fact, in my whole career than there is now. Your instructional coaching, all of these packages that are just really well researched. But unfortunately, we still haven't given professionals the time to engage in these really meaningful activities.
Do you know what? That's that didn't come into my head, but now, first off the bat, but now you've said that, I think that's a really good point, is the mentoring, the coaching, the time to do that. It's interesting because that's sort of going down, and you mentioned MPQs as well. I guess that's sort of going down. You're basically saying that increased professional development and time for it is going to make a difference for the tougher schools. You're saying that above some of the things Phil was saying, or are you just saying with that?
I think that's got to come first. I think you've got to have the knowledge and the skills to be able to affect change in places like that. And a lot of people I've certainly seen a lot of people that it's just based on character, their leadership or their teaching style is just based on personality and not much else, because that gets you through the day in tough schools. I think
I'd rather you not. Can you talk about me behind my back, Bernie? If that's all right.
I just think it's just got to be more than that in tough schools. You've got to have a skill set to genuinely affect change.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it is easy to fall into that sort of thing. And like you say, having that professional framework and the professional approach is important and really beneficial. I mean, from a school leader perspective, do you think enough school leaders do that?
Look, I've seen quite a low bar in some schools. I've seen quite people kind of just nodding teachers through, performance management or whatever, because they have a quiet classroom or they are perceived to have strong behaviour management. But for me, it's got to be more than that in order to really kind of do justice to the community, do justice to the children. And
what does that mean, though? Are you talking about good teaching, like better teaching, or are you talking about?
I'm talking about better teaching. I'm talking about better leadership. I'm talking about more knowledgeable, structures in schools, because I think some schools, that because of the recruitment issues, they nod along really poor teachers.
That's interesting. That is interesting. I'd love to know what listeners think about that. Anyone who's listening, feel free to comment. Just you've got the little tweet icon in the bottom right if you're listening live. If you're listening back as a podcast, drop us an email, info@ttradio.org or whatever, and give us a comment on the conversation. But what makes you think that? What makes so? I'm interested in that. Like, why would that not be the same in the easier schools, the so-called easier schools? Or are you saying it is? It's just across the board.
I think it is everywhere. I think you get it everywhere, and I think more so in current times because of the recruitment crisis. People are scared to tackle inadequate teaching because you could potentially be leaving a gap in your workforce. It's sounding really negative, this, but I think going back to my original point is we've got to invest in high quality teaching and learning, high quality professional development, so that staff have the tools to really make a difference.
I mean, of course, again, to play devil's advocate, there'll be those listening to that saying, if you mentioned if somebody masters classroom management, so they have a sort of well-behaved classroom environment, but that's it, sort of thing. Is that inadequate in a tough school?
Yeah, I think you've got to be to be a full package,
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just wondering because it's a very difficult job. So it's just where you put that bar, I guess, of inadequacy versus sort of good or better, if that makes sense, or whatever. I hate to use Ofsted wording, but yeah, fair enough. I wouldn't feel you probably haven't heard anything we've just been talking about, have you?
No, but knowing Bernie, I think it's probably been excellent in talking about
it has.
Professional
professional
development. I dare say it was about.
Very well. Let me relay it back. Bernie was basically saying that, and Bernie, you correct me if I'm wrong in anything I say next. She was saying that number one, that in tougher schools, the thing that would make the one of the biggest differences would be to start with a professional development culture where new teachers particularly have time for mentoring and coaching and she was saying that qualifications like NPQs have helped to professionalize things in tougher schools. She was also, though, saying that in some tougher schools, they nod through people through professional development who are sometimes inadequate teachers. And there is sometimes a bit of an acceptance of the big personality in the inadequate school type, inadequate teaching guised in big personality and sort of, good behavior management, but that's it, like silent classroom, passive performance management. and Bernie was saying that she thought that was a issue. Bernie, correct me if I'm wrong in anything I just said.
Yeah, I think possibly the fact that we haven't got the time balance. I mean, a lot of these programs are brilliantly well intentioned, but we've got to be realists. We're not giving our mentors or our coaches enough time. Is really an hour a week on the ECF enough time to deliver such a high complex program of professional development with novice teachers? I don't think we've got it right.
Are you saying that they're put in? Are you saying that thing you were saying about maybe passing people through professional development cycles who shouldn't be? Are you saying that's a thing that you're seeing more of? Is that what you're saying? Are you saying that's becoming more of an issue because of the retention crisis that schools are going, well, we'll just pass them through?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly not seen as high a quality ITT coming through. I mean, that could be just context. It could just be perception. I'm very aware that I'm not working on a mass scale.
Well, you're not the first guest who's actually said that.
Yeah.
I did a show with someone called Sarah Dalton about maybe 2 months ago, and she said exactly what you've just said.
Yeah, so I think there's that, but I also think you've got a physician in a classroom, you've got a chemist teacher in a classroom, or you are very aware as a school leader that they are rare, and you are very aware that you're going to have to put the legwork in to get that person better, and it's you can't risk people leaving the school or whatever because you're going to struggle to recruit in that subject.
Yeah. Phil, I'll bring you back in. What advice would you give to teachers themselves who are considering working in a school that's perceived to be tough?
Go and visit. Go and have a look at the school, because as Bernie said, one of the biggest draws for me to work in the school that I was working at the time of the book came out was I had done, as Bernie knows, I'd done 3 years of a project. I think I'd spoke to you about this time at the time. So I was working between Buckfield Research School and Teacher Development Trust, and I went into that school on a weekly basis, and everything that people were saying about these schools, well, I was finding to be totally wrong. So I was getting in there thinking, these are some fantastic people I'm working with here, from the reception staff right through to the classroom teachers, but also it's very much an open door thing. Go and look at lessons, go and meet people. And I'm just thinking, the perception here is completely wrong. So the first thing I would say is go and have a look at the school. Go and have a look at the school when it's functioning. Don't go and look, if a head teacher says to you, come in at 4:00 in the evening, I say, that's fine, that's great, because head teachers are busy people. But please, can you say, would it be all right if I came in again during the school day, and would it be okay if I walked all around the corridors and had a look at what's going on and get a feel for the place? Because when you get a feel for these schools, you then know that this is potentially the right school for you to work in, and you can give it the chance that perception wouldn't let you do. So I would say, first, people see past the grade, the Ofsted criteria, or potentially even see past some of the academic performance and results, because there's no contextual value added these days in terms of what these students are coming in with. I know there's Progress 8 and people are going to shout at me and say, well, that's a good factor potentially, but obviously there's issues with that as well. So visit, have a look, speak to people, and some of these schools could be the best places to work. The best people work in these schools, and the most development and the quickest development you will get is in a well-run tougher school. If you want to go and visit Mark Allen's school, who does one of the chapters in it, I would advise that you do that, because it's a perfect example of a school in a harder context that is doing great things and will be brilliant for anyone to work at.
Super. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, is that going to be enough for some people? You mentioned maybe financial incentives and stuff like that. Do you think we need to increase the incentives, whether that be financial or otherwise?
I think Ofsted need to take account of context, Tom. I think that's the biggest thing. Take away the fear factor from people applying for these jobs. So, when Bernie Kay becomes a head teacher, which is inevitable at any time, you don't want your career to be imploding within the first 12 months of being in there, despite how good these people are, because somebody gets parachuted in from outside, looks at it for 2 days and goes, you haven't got this, you don't do that, and this is there you go. That's the problem. And then the 2 years that you get alongside that with any number of highly paid experts who will come in, and I've been one, Tom, so I can talk about this. Any number of highly paid experts who will come in with their badge and tell you, do this, do that, do the other, taking no accountability for what happens at the end of it, and taking lots of, I'll be careful, I'll say resources as a euphemism, taking lots of resources as well while they're doing it. So, it puts people off. So take away that fear factor, have some accountability for context for schools in these circumstances, and then people will want to take the chance, and they don't have to be seen as brave or stupid. They have to be seen as, helping out a community that really would benefit from their brilliant experience.
No, absolutely. Really, really good answer. I think we've sort of come to the end of the conversation, but we could have literally talked for probably another 3 or 4 hours about this, just because there's so much to talk about and unpick in there. I think you and Bernie have actually both made some really, really good points throughout, and some really interesting points as well. So thank you ever so much. Just a final mention, everyone, if you're listening to this and you've only just joined, or you've joined and you want to catch up, this will be published as a podcast through Teachers Talk Radio on all good podcast platforms, so you can do that. Obviously, this show is supported by John Catt Educational, and John Catt have also published Phil's book, and Phil has mentioned his book a few times during the show this evening. And if you want to grab the book, it's called Some Schools Are Harder Than Others by Phil Naylor, and you can get it at johncattbookshop.com. And if you get it, you can get 20% off the book by using the code JCTTR2425, and that applies to any book on the John Catt website as well that you might be interested in getting. And we thank John Catt for supporting all of our shows at Teachers Talk Radio. Thank you very much to everybody who has listened live and contributed to the conversation via tweets or texts or anything else. That's been great. If you want to get in touch with Teachers Talk Radio, then please just drop us a line on the website, ttradio.org, or drop us an email, info@ttradio.org, and let us know your thoughts. And maybe, a host. Bernie, you'd be an amazing host on Teachers Talk Radio.
Okay, I'm not sure I could ask all those questions, but thank you.
Brilliant.
Tom, she absolutely would. She's done it before. I mean, those of you that want to catch some more Bernie Kay, go to some back episodes of Naylor's Natter. We've many a time we've done it together, and Bernie's done a few on her own as well. So I
didn't know that.
She has. So 100% endorse Bernie Kay's abilities in the podcasting forum, definitely.
But she's not like the
You are too kind.
She's not like the legend of Phil Naylor, let's be honest.
She hasn't got a theme tune yet, but you never know this time.
No. Anyway, guys, thank you ever so much, and take care. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Monday.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.